Hello, and welcome to another episode of When All Is Read and Done. My name is Aimee.
And I'm Josh, and we're a podcast where we make sense of the world one book at a time. So, Aimee, how has your week been, and what have you been reading or doing?
It's been good. So I lost a losing domestic battle at home because my husband, he bought a massive television, which I opposed for about 2 years now. But yeah, I finally gave in because I kind of visualized myself living in a bohemian house with only books. But obviously, I lost that battle.
Have you all started watching anything yet?
We watched the Dark Knight yesterday. And it wasn't as good as I remembered it to be. Maybe I have a different lens now. Everything seems a little bit misogynistic. Like this is clearly made for men who quote Fight Club,
Mm-hmm.
And what about you? What have you read and done this week?
Well, my week has been great. One of the things that I'm really grateful for is that we have had some really wonderful support and feedback for episode 1.
Wow,
right?
lovely. And what are some of those feedback?
Well, everybody loves you, Aimee. So
thank you. Bit shy now.
Yeah, they should. You're amazing. But some have told me that I sound like sadness from inside out. And I don't know how I feel about that,
Now that you've mentioned it, I don't think I can unhear that.
Yeah, I've actually got a line reading for you if you want.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm too sad to walk. Just give me a few hours.
And now no one can unhear sadness.
Yeah, so basically
podcast.
I've been spending my week trying to come to terms with being sadness.
But sadness is a lot of people's favorite character in the film. So
she's
don't
my
feel
favorite
too
character
bad
as
about
well.
that.
Yeah, I love sadness. So, I'm probably just going to embrace it moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So, should you tell everyone what our episode is about this week?
Well, this week, we are going to be talking about diversifying our bookshelf. So in our previous episode, we had talked a little bit about, reading more diverse characters. And we thought maybe for this episode, it would be a good continuation to look into how is it that we can actually expand the type of authors that we are picking up. So for you, Aimee, how did you start reading more diversity, as in, looking into more diverse authors?
Oh man, I really hate to say this, but I have to credit Donald Trump for this. Don't quote me on that. But I don't know if this is a direct consequence of just having to read this ridiculously sexist and prejudiced things that come out of Twitter or the news at the time. But in 2016, I started to take a good hard look at the authors that I personally read. So imagine for like 2 decades or so, my reading diet has been mostly white, mostly straight, and mostly male. It's almost like, going to a buffet and then only eating bread. I mean, I love bread, but you're not going to have that all the time, 3 meals a day.
Well, so isn't that what you all do in the UK?
Potatoes. We do that for potatoes.
Oh, no.
So yeah, I love potatoes. They're versatile. They come in many forms, but you're obviously not gonna have potatoes for every meal. So this was all like pre-Goodreads, pre-Bookstagram. So only for myself. Initially, I was just trying to make sure that I read as many female authors as I did male ones, and this sort of evolved into moving away from Euro or US centric narratives and authors. So obviously, in some genres, this is more accessible than others. Yeah, and what about yourself?
No, it's the same thing. I think it also means for me moving away from a Western cisgender perspective to one that is more inclusive. I guess when I talk about diversifying my bookshelf, what it means really is to see the reality of the world that I live in better represented on my bookshelf. And diversity, I think one of the really important things that has dawned on me is that diversity really needs to start closer to home, right? And I really want to start consciously picking up authors from the Southeast Asian region because being Malaysian, right, our lives are multifaceted, right? So in Malaysia, for example, it's just filled with people from different cultures, genders, sexual identities, socioeconomic backgrounds and beliefs. And I am starting to realize that, my bookshelf should reflect that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you've said, Josh. So I would say that, diversifying your bookshelf is always an ongoing journey, and we can always be better. So in the last 5 years or so, I started to purposefully seek out diverse authors. So this isn't to say that writing outside your experience is wrong, because after all, like, isn't that what creative writing is about? Like,
Yeah.
I don't have to live in space or be an alien to write a fantasy novel, for example.
Yeah.
But there is a history of majority group authors writing outside of their experience to tell diverse stories. And some of these books are wonderful, and we've all read them. So, like, for example, for myself, the first book that I've read with an intersex protagonist was Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. And this was back in 2002. He actually won a Pulitzer Prize for this story. And until this day, like, this book is still often referenced by medical professionals, and the writing is absolutely beautiful. But, from my standpoint, something has got to be said about a world where a heterosexual and cisgender male can write about the intersex experience and win a Pulitzer Prize for it. While most intersex transgender people, they are forced to conform to heteronormativity, and worse, they're even persecuted in a lot of cultures. So for me, I started to be more aware of own voices in publishing, and I tried to make a conscious effort to read stories authored by own voices writers.
And I think maybe for our listeners, Aimee, who don't know what own voices means, could you maybe define it for them?
Yeah, sure. So own voices is a term coined by author. Her name is Corinne Duvis. So back in 2015 on Twitter, she used the hashtag own voices to highlight children literature about diverse characters, actually written by authors from that same diverse group.
Yeah, and one of our recent book club meetings, I think, really brought home for me the importance of reading own voice authors. So if you remember, we had one book club where the theme was a holiday read or a travel read, right? And I decided that I wanted to pick up a book about Myanmar, because that is a country that is very near to my heart due to the work that I'm doing with Myanmar refugees. And I wanted to learn more about their country and the history. And the book that I chose was A Savage Dreamland by David Emer. It has a 4.0 rating on Goodreads, right? And, I've read it. His writing is clear, it's informative, and it's mostly empathetic. But there were bits that made me feel a little bit uneasy, right? Like when he described the smell of Burmese cooking as powerful and unwelcome. And I think one of the things that dawned on me as I was reading that is that I'm trying to learn more about this country, Myanmar, from the perspective of an outsider. And the more I read, the more I asked myself, why didn't I start with a book written by a Burmese author?
Yeah.
Tan Min Oo, who is a celebrated Burmese historian, he has written numerous books about Myanmar. And the latest one came out in 2019, right? The Hidden History of Burma. So why didn't I seek that book out? It's something that I have to wrestle with. Diversifying your bookshelf is a journey. And I think for myself, what I do now is that beyond picking up a book and going, oh, this title is interesting and it has great reviews on Goodreads, right? If the author is white, I'll ask myself, can I find something that is similar written by an Asian author or a person of color, or maybe a book written by a female or trans author? Because I think at the end of the day, I don't want to confine myself to a single narrow point of view, right? Our world is so vast and our collective experiences are almost limitless, right? And I want to embrace that, and I want my bookshelf to be able to reflect that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, even from what you're saying, it's not like you didn't enjoy A Savage Dreamland, and it was valuable to you in many ways. And obviously what we're doing here is we're not policing what authors should and shouldn't write. Like, there shouldn't be things that are off limits to authors. But as a reader, I think we can be mindful of who we choose to support and amplify in that sense. So, authors who write outside their own experience without research, and I do emphasize without research, they run the risk of perpetuating harmful stereotypes, tropes, and inaccuracies, especially when they're writing about marginalized people. I mean, for you, it was really unsavory to read about, a white author who lives in Burma, is writing about Burma, and then saying things like, oh, the food smells oily, or the food smells bad.
Yeah. And so it's not like David Emer didn't do his research, right? He did. he was there. It was just that it's the perspective that you're choosing. And I think oftentimes that is when we talk about diversity, I think that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. And in some circumstances, authors writing outside of own voices can also be extremely harmful. So an extreme example that I can think of is Jean Sassen's, she's the wildly popular author of the Princess series. So these books are set in Saudi Arabia, and they do portray Muslims as misogynistic and fanatical. And if these serve as the only books that someone reads set in Saudi Arabia, they're likely to have a very skewed perception of this country and its people. So authors, whether they mean it or not, like they sometimes can perpetuate like monolithic and harmful stereotypes and tropes.
Yeah.
And the second point that I really take issue with and feel pretty strongly about is gatekeeping in publishing. So for the longest time, books by non-white authors are deemed unpublishable or unmarketable because they say, people just don't buy books with a gay protagonist or a Black protagonist or an Asian main character. And this is simply untrue, because time and time again, when white or male authors, they publish stories about marginalized groups, they receive bigger advances, they receive accolades, they receive recognition, while own voices authors, they continue to fight just to, get a foot through the door.
Yeah. And, when we were preparing for this episode, I actually went and looked up Lee and Low Books, who released their Diversity Baseline Survey 2.0. And they found that in 2019, 76% of the people in the publishing industry in America were white, 81% of them were straight, and 89% of them were non-disabled. If you have this monolithic group that is dominating the publishing industry, then it speaks to like what you're saying, right? About gatekeeping, where it's not that people aren't interested in reading about these authors, but if all the authors that I see on my bookshelf come from a certain group of people, then sometimes, that might subconsciously affect, the authors that I choose to pick up. In our last episode, I spoke about Marjorie Liu and the work that she's doing with Monstrous. And she had a fantastic quote where she was saying, it's great we have a female Thor, it's great that we have a Black Captain America, but those are just optics. It's optics of change. And unless you have structural diversity, the structural change behind the scenes, more women, more people of color actually calling the shots and editing these books, those optics won't last. I love graphic novels. I love comic books, right?
Yep.
And I really do see the impact of this in the comic books that I pick up. And I think one of the things that happened when I was preparing for this episode was I wanted to do an audit of my bookshelf, right? I wanted to see, okay, I think I am reading pretty diverse characters, but is that translating into reading diverse authors? And what I found was that of the 19 graphic novels or series that I have on my physical shelf, which explicitly feature a female lead character, 15 of them are written by white men. Right? There are only 3 women writers, right?
Even though the characters themselves are very diverse.
Yeah. Only one of them is written by a woman of color, Marjorie Liu, right? And so my support for comic books that feature female, minority, or LGBTQ characters doesn't translate into support for authors that I claim that I want to see. I want to see women authors, person of color, right? LGBTQI, person with disabilities. I think this is a dissonance that I need to bridge. And I'm going to give you an example, right? There's this sci-fi graphic novel that I love. And, sci-fi is a genre that has marginalized or sidelined women for the longest time. And it's called Paper Girls, right? And it places female and LGBTQ characters right at its center. And it's written by Brian K. Vaughan, who is a cisgender male. And now I love Brian K. Vaughan, right? But, I'm becoming aware that, hey, why couldn't this book have been written or published by someone who actually is a woman or actually is queer? And what are the barriers that stand in the way of, women authors, queer authors in getting publishing books that are from that genre? And why is it that we are focusing on, predominantly white male authors?
Yeah. So we know that these stories, they definitely do exist, but, it's probably very hard for them to get published in the first place. Or even when they're published, they probably don't get the same kind of marketing. They don't have the same kind of support, and it doesn't reach the readers in that way unless we purposefully seek them out. So it's funny that you mentioned Marjorie Liu because one of my favorite reads from last year was R.F. Kuang or Rebecca Kuang's The Poppy Wars series. So this is a political fantasy trilogy based on World War II, the military conflicts between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan.
Yeah, I have a close friend who told me that the Poppy War series is actually better than the Lord of the Rings, which
I'm not sure if we're gonna get hate mail from this.
I haven't read Poppy Wars, and you love it, so maybe it's something that I need to pick up as well.
Yeah, but it resonated because it's relatable to me. The characters are Chinese and they have Chinese names, and this is set in World War II. But instead of having 10 books about Dunkirk, this is something central around China and Japan, and that was a very important mark in history in that region. So coming back to what you said about white authors writing about diverse characters, Rebecca Kuang herself, she made an incredible speech when she picked up a Hugo Award for Best New Writer. So she made it a point to say in her speech that authors of color, they only get paid a fraction of what white authors get, and they're also pigeonholed along with other authors of color whose work aren't even similar. She also reveals some pretty jarring things about the publishing industry, where authors of color are more likely to face microaggression, sexual harassment, and how interest in them are more often about their personal trauma rather than their craft.
Yeah. And I had listened to Rebecca Kuang's speech as well when she picked up the award, right? And I found it very telling. And I'm going to go back again to Brian K. Vaughan. And again, I love Brian K. Vaughan. I love that he is writing diverse characters. But in a 2015 interview that he did with Mother Jones on Black and queer heroes in comic books, right? And I just want to contrast it with what Rebecca Kuang said. He says, I've never gotten anything but support and thanks from people for having diverse books. People just want good stories. And when I read that, I was like, Brian, it does sound like you are coming from a place of privilege, right? Because we know that for women authors or people of color, getting their foot in the door is so difficult. And even when they do, and even when they tell stories that are true to themselves, they get all kind of misogynistic, racist hate being thrown at them. And I think it's important that we support them, right? I think it's important that if we want to see more of these authors being on our bookshelves, being recommended, that we need to put our money where our mouth is. That if I want to see that, I need to go out and start purchasing books from these authors to show that I support them, like vote with my wallet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rebecca Kuang, this is after, her success and the popularity of the book. She still closed the speech with, and I quote, "If I had known all of that when I went into the industry, I don't know if I would have done it." And so it's time for authors like Brian to pass the mic.
Yeah, and we just wonder how many authors like Rebecca Kuang that we have missed out on because,
they would have
this gatekeeping
just given up,
and because or who have given up along the way, right? And I think that's a really sobering thought. So we are now going to move to our favorite segment of the episode, which is Read and Done Recs, or RADRecs for short. And this is where we make recommendations based on this episode for your next favorite read, and hopefully it's not one that's going to be permanently parked in your TBR list. Yeah, so I have two quick recommendations. If you, like me, love comic books and you would like to diversify the authors that you're picking up, there are two LGBTQ authors that I absolutely adore and I hope that you love as well. So Maia Kobabe wrote a beautiful memoir called Genderqueer. It's about Maia's story growing up, having been assigned female at birth, and discovering he is queer, non-binary, and asexual. It is vulnerable, it is moving, and an extremely readable introduction to non-binary gender identities for cisgender readers like myself. Also, another author that I absolutely adore, and I know that you too do, Aimee, is Tillie Walden.
I love Tillie Walden.
And her first sci-fi story is On a Sunbeam, which is a sweet, ethereal coming-of-age tale, which also has a romance intertwined in it about a small crew that travels outer space, documenting and repairing old buildings. And it is a world that is wholly filled with female and non-binary characters, and I love it. Aimee loves it, and it's available online
Yes.
for free.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Do you want to tell everybody what the website is if they're interested?
Yeah, I think it's on a sunbeam.com. So, you have absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be reading Tillie Walden's on a Sunbeam. So what about you, Aimee? Like, do you have any RADRecs for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've already mentioned the Poppy War series. So it's a trilogy: the Poppy War, the Dragon Republic, and the Burning God. And I highly, highly, highly recommend all of them. But another one that's very close to my heart as well is Hanna Alkaf's The Weight of Our Sky.
Oh, yeah.
So have you read that one? So it does center around May 13, 1969.
No, I have not. I haven't read that, but it's gotten a lot of buzz, and I know that a lot of people here have read it, and I think it's really interesting because it centers around a topic that, in general discourse, people would say, "Oh, it's a sensitive issue. You're not supposed to talk about it," and for her to really put it front and center in a novel, and it's a debut novel as well, right?
Yes, and it's also a young adult novel. So I think not only putting a topic that people tend to avoid, but also framing this in a way that our young readers can learn to talk about it, can open up about difficult conversations, especially in our current political climate. I think that's very, very impressive on the part of Hanna.
Yeah, I really need to pick that up. I haven't read that yet.
Yeah, and you love graphic novels. So actually this book is also available in a webtoon format. So if
wow.
You didn't know that? Oh, great. Yeah, you should check it out.
No, I definitely will. Yeah.
Yeah, so for our readers who want to start exploring own voices a little more, like in these modern times, it's fairly easy to research your authors. I also tend not to follow big book prizes, as typically those have like an exorbitantly expensive entry fee and only huge publishers can afford to put their nominations forward. So instead, what I do is I seek out my book recommendations from friends, from book clubs, from podcasts, and and most recently from Bookstagram. So I actually do have a Bookstagrammer recommendation. A very rad Bookstagrammer that I love is Christine from Look Pretty Books. And she was the first person who introduced me to own voices and why this is important. And her Bookstagram is super honest. Her photography is also really fun. She's a Malaysian Bookstagrammer and she currently lives in the US. And she recommends really excellent and diverse migration stories, which I love.
Well, one that I absolutely have to talk about if we are talking about Bookstagrammers is Nat from anattynook.
She's lovely. I love her.
Yeah, she is. And she's from Singapore. And she frequently provides fantastic recommendations for singlet, queer reads, feminist reads, intersectional, climates, and Southeast Asian books. And these are all issues that I really need to learn more about, read more about. So if you are interested in these topics, do check out anattynook. Like, she's fantastic.
And I think that's a wonderful way to conclude the episode. So I hope you liked this episode. And if you did, please like and subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also contact us on our Instagram, Read and Done. If you'd like to speak to us, feel free to slide into our DMs. Please let us know if Josh actually does sound like sadness from inside out, because I can't unhear it now.
Oh, no.
Especially when you do that.
Yeah. Oh, this has been a fun episode, Aimee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.